everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director and founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy in Media, Pennsylvania. I'm board certified in clinical social work and psychodrama, and I'm an experiential therapy trainer and educator. I'm really excited that you found this video, and I hope that you find it helpful in your work. This is part of an ongoing video series highlighting my recently published book, Social Work, Sociometry, and Psychodrama, Experiential Approaches for Group Therapists, Community Leaders, and Social Workers. In this video series, we'll be going through the book chapter by chapter to articulate some of the content of the book, to warm you up to the book perhaps, or to help you further understand, process, and digest the content and the processes that are outlined in this book. If you haven't already gotten a copy of the book, you can download it for free online at Springer Nature's website, the publisher, or on Amazon through their ebook platform. If you do find the book helpful, I would be incredibly grateful if you considered leaving an Amazon review, an honest Amazon review about the book, so that we can help reach future audiences. In this video, we'll be focusing on Chapter 5 of the book. Chapter 5 is on sociometry and social work theory. So if you haven't heard of the term sociometry before, the simplest way to think of sociometry is that it's just a fancy word for group dynamics. If we take the word sociometry and split it in half, we have sociometry. And so we can infer that sociometry is about the measurement of social aspects of experience. It's about measurements within groups. Sociometry is about the inquiry into the evolution of groups, the position of individuals within groups. It's both a qualitative and quantitative method for exploring the quantity of relationships, the matrix of relationships within a group, or within a community, or within society, while also exploring the nature of those relationships, the quality of those relationships, the characteristics of those relationships. So sociometry is the first part of psychodrama's triadic system: sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy. I encourage you to check out some of the other videos in this series to learn more about the other parts of the triadic system. In this video, we're going to focus entirely on sociometry. So it's important to keep in mind that sociometry is a system with three parts. So the first part is the theory, sociometric theory. This is a theory of society. It's a theory of interpersonal relations, and it's a theory about groups and communities. The second part of the system is the research aspect. So sociometry is also a research method for studying the structure of groups, communities, society, and the relationships and dynamics within groups and society. And the third part of the sociometric system is the clinical practice, or practice in general, where we use sociometric tools and tests for reorganizing groups for optimal functionality. So a sociometrist could assess the underlying dynamics of a group, community, or organization using sociometric means, and then using sociometry tools or other tools intervene on those underlying dynamics within the group or organization to promote greater health, greater functioning within that group or community. There's a quote from Jacob Moreno, the founder of Sociometry, Psychodrama, that I'd like to read to you. This is from the first book on group psychotherapy. Moreno writes, "Group psychotherapy, sociometry, and psychodrama are like three sons born from one another. They grew together and nourished each other. Group psychotherapy may never have succeeded had sociometry not followed immediately and spread the news about the group and the dynamics of group structure. All three developments are the products of a single germinal idea." So in this quote, we can see a little bit about how Moreno thinks about sociometry, and how it's an integral part of his triadic system: sociometry, psychodrama, and group psychotherapy. There's been a tendency in the field to isolate psychodrama outside of the triadic system and to consider and practice it as its own entity, which is misleading and not in integrity with the way the method was created and designed. Moreno used to even say that he would use psychodrama to get people into the room so that he could teach them about sociometry. So he really, really believed in the importance of sociometry. Perhaps Moreno's most famous quote, which is the beginning of one of his most famous books, Who Shall Survive? It's also the motto of the American Board of Examiners in Psychodrama and the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama. In the quote, he says that a truly therapeutic procedure cannot have less an objective than the whole of mankind. Many people don't realize there's a second part to that quote that really points to the importance of sociometry. The second part of that quote, the second part of that sentence: but no adequate therapy can be prescribed as long as mankind is not a unity in some fashion, and as long as its organization remains unknown. This is on page 3 of Who Shall Survive. This was a point that my trainer, Ed Schreiber, really emphasizes, that we need to look at the entire quote. And this is a quote that really, really highlights the importance of sociometry, that we can't create a truly therapeutic procedure that approaches all of humankind, that intervenes on the underlying dynamics within society and within other groups. We can't prescribe any kind of therapy unless we first do some sociometric assessment to understand the underlying dynamics within society and within groups within society. In many ways, sociometry is unique in that it works to bridge the gaps between psychology and sociology. It serves as a bridge in that way. Interestingly, the sociologists, the American sociologists, really adopted sociometry and actually published Moreno's Sociometry Journal for decades. They were some of the first to really celebrate and recognize Moreno's work when he immigrated to the United States. Moreno's sociometric work, and particularly the research aspect of it, became the foundation for participatory action research. And if you look in the handbook of participatory action research, you'll find references to Moreno and his early contributions to the field, to this research approach. And sociometry is also the foundation of social network theories and social network research. So although it's largely unknown in itself, it's supported the development of other methods that have become quite popular. Group dynamics research is another one. Jonathan Moreno, the son of Jacob Moreno, also a professor of bioethics at University of Pennsylvania, he writes that sociometry is a science by, for, and of the people. So sociometry is intimately connected to democracy. It's looking at the distribution of choices and preferences, votes, perhaps, within a group. In many ways, sociometry tries to bridge the gap in research between quantitative and qualitative explorations of interpersonal relations. Moreno writes that the qualitative aspect of social structures is not destroyed or forgotten. Instead, it's integrated into the quantitative operations. It acts from within. The two aspects of structure are treated in combination as a unit when using sociometric methods. So sociometry tries to integrate aspects of both quantitative and qualitative research designs. In 1943, Moreno writes that sociometry has taught us to be pessimistic, critical of all enterprises which try to solve problems of human relations without the most intensive participation of the people involved and the most intensive knowledge of their psychosocial living conditions. So you can see in this quote how Moreno's thinking strongly reflects and mirrors participatory action research, where he's highlighting the importance of involving the participants in the exploration, in the research. So there's a lot that goes into sociometry theory, practice, and research. We're going to go through a bunch of different subfields and topics and interventions, methods, ideas, theories within the larger field of sociometry. I think the best beginning place is to first talk about Moreno's encounter theory and his interpersonal theory. Moreno says that the simplest definition of his encounter theory and his interpersonal theory is outlined in his 1914 poem, An Invitation to an Encounter. It's important to keep in mind that this poem and a large portion of Moreno's early work was originally written in German and translated to English, and that some of the meaning, the precise meanings, can get lost in translation. Moreno says particularly that the word for encounter that he uses in German has a lot more meaning in the German language, the term that he uses, and that it's kind of sterilized when translated to English. Anyway, his poem reads, "A meeting of two, eye to eye, face to face. When you are near, I will tear out your eyes and place them instead of mine, and you will tear my eyes out and place them instead of yours. Then I will look at you with your eyes, and you will look at me with mine." So this is the foundation of Moreno's interpersonal theory. And you can see how strongly related this quote is to Moreno's psychodrama intervention of role reversal. Tearing out your eyes, giving them to someone else, tearing out someone else's eyes and taking them on as your own, seeing yourself through someone else. So Moreno says that the meaning of encounter, his intended meaning, is that it's much more than just a meeting. It's more of an experiencing of two people, that two people are sharing space with all of their strengths and weaknesses, two human actors seething with spontaneity, really encountering each other on a number of different layers. Interestingly, there's a lot of overlap between Moreno's encounter philosophy and Martin Buber's I and thou concept, which was actually published 9 years after Moreno's encounter poem. There's some interesting historical research about the relationship between Jacob Moreno and Martin Buber. Turns out that they worked together on the editorial board of a journal, the Diamond Journal, and that they clearly had an impact on each other's thinking. It seems that Buber's I and thou concept was probably influenced by Moreno's encounter poem and encounter philosophy, which had been published 9 years earlier. So the encounter theory, the interpersonal relations theory, is important to know and important to consider when we talk about sociometry. As we expand a little bit broader than just an encounter between two people in terms of sociometric theory, we have the social atom. The social atom is another really core sociometric theory and intervention assessment tool. It really can be used in a number of different ways. A social atom is basically a depiction of one's social network, the closest relationships within one's social network. The social atom is created by having an individual draw themselves on the center of a page and then draw the closest relationships surrounding them on that page. And when they draw those relationships, traditionally there was different shapes that are used for different genders, which I don't think is very, it's too outdated, and it doesn't fit with modern times. It's very binary and isn't very inclusive for non-binary and transgendered folks. So I don't think it's a very useful way of doing the social atom, or genograms for that matter. One of my social work students, Jordan, had a great suggestion that we allow clients to use whatever shapes they want to represent the different people in their life, rather than prescribing certain shapes for men and certain shapes for women. And when we do this, we actually get a whole lot more information about their perception of that person when they're allowed to use whatever shape they want to depict that person on their social atom. So I suggest using these instructions for the social atom instead of the traditional ones. So the client draws himself in the center, then they use shapes based on size and proximity in relationship to themselves on the page to depict the other important people in their life. Drawing that shape to size, to scale, based on how much space that person takes up in their life, or how much space they give that person in their life. And then they're also drawing the shape in proximity to themselves using closeness or distance based on how close or how far away they feel to that person. And then the actual line connecting them to that person on the page indicates the nature of the relationship. So traditionally, a straight, solid line indicates a connected relationship. A squiggly line can represent a conflicting relationship. A dotted line could represent a lost relationship. And there's a lot of different ways of creating the social atom. So at its core, though, the social atom is a depiction of one's social life, the important relationships in one's social life. And you can see a pretty strong connection already to the social work field. The social atom is a way of operationalizing person and environment theory, and that we're considering the individual within their social environment. There's a ton of different ways to create the social atom and ways to modify it for different clients, different goals, different situations, different communities. Some of the different ways it's been modified include, rather than only putting relationships, individuals on the social atom, you could invite clients or participants to also include groups, communities, collectives, or organizations that they're a part of or in relationship to on the social atom. In substance use treatment, it's pretty common to instruct clients to draw a social atom, but to also include a depiction of their relationship to their substance of choice or to alcohol on their social atom, which can illuminate a lot for the client. In eating disorder treatment, many times one's relationship to food or different types of food can be included on the social atom. There's ways of modifying it to be more strength-based, where you could have clients draw their strengths in the format of a social atom. It can be really modified in a whole lot of different ways. There's a lot of room for spontaneity and creativity, really, in all of psychodrama and sociometry practice. And if you watch the video on chapter 4, you would remember that psychodrama and sociometry are based on spontaneity creativity theory. So when we're drawing a social atom, it can be drawn in the here and now. Draw a here and now depiction of the current state of your social circle, your social life. It can be drawn based on a moment in the past. So we might say to a client, I want you to think about when you were in the depths of your heroin addiction years ago, or months ago, or weeks ago. I want you to draw a social atom that depicts the nature of your social life and your relationships at that point in time. And we can compare it to a drawing of the social atom today, which can be really useful. And we can also draw future social atoms. We could invite a client to draw a ideal future social atom. What would you like your social atom to look like a month from now, a year from now? It can be really useful as an assessment tool and as a treatment planning tool. There's been times where I've invited clients to draw a social atom based on what they would like their social life to look like in the future. This is especially helpful for clients who struggle with social skills or social anxiety or relationships, and that you're helping them create a concrete vision, a depiction of what they would like their relationships and social life to look like. I found this to be probably the most efficient and helpful assessment of one's social life. There's been times where I've worked with individual psychotherapy clients, and over the course of meeting with them, talking with them, interviewing them, asking them to fill out intake paperwork, they've told me bits and pieces about their relationships and social life. And I'm thinking of a specific case where after months of working together, I still felt like I didn't have all the information I wanted or needed about their social life. And I asked them to draw a social atom for me to depict their relationships. And I got more information out of them drawing that social atom, which took 10 or 15 minutes, than hours and hours of meetings over the past several months with that client. So this can be an incredibly helpful assessment tool. Historically, it's interesting to note that the social atom, which seems to have been created all the way back in the early part of the 1900s, maybe 1930s, about the 1930s, that it influenced the later development of the genogram and eco-maps, which are particularly popular in the social work field and in family work, family systems, family therapy. So there's another historical connection here between social work and psychodrama. Moreno talks about the social atom as the smallest of the social structures, and that the social atom is composed of various interpersonal relationships. So multiple relationships make up the social atom. Then multiple social atoms integrate together, creating social networks, and multiple social networks integrate together, creating society as a larger group. And so one's social atom is constantly changing, although there seem to be patterns that reemerge within the social atom. And perhaps this could be related to attachment styles, relational reenactments, or what Moreno calls sociostasis. This is actually a term that Moreno coined nearly 100 years ago, which has been popularized more recently by some of the interpersonal neurobiologists who are starting to use this term without reference to Moreno. Sociostasis describes, think of it as homeostasis in the social context. That there's layers and layers of attractions and repulsions within our relationships, within our social atoms, within society, within our social networks, within all of our relationships. And that we're constantly trying to find balance within that system of attractions and repulsions. And so that point of balance, that threshold where we feel balanced and held within our relationships, is what Moreno refers to as sociostasis. And so, again, we find connection to person and environment theory. Moreno suggests that this network, these layers of attractions and repulsions within our social atom, are responsible for many of the internal intrapsychic tensions that human beings experience. So this is where Moreno was a bit radical compared to some of his colleagues 100 years ago, where he was suggesting that psychological issues were in part or entirely caused by relationships or lack of. Again, here we find connection to Moreno and social work philosophy. In 1953, this would be in the second edition of Who Shall Survive, Moreno writes that every individual functions in a system which is confined by two boundaries: the emotional expansiveness of their own personality and the socio-emotional pressure exerted upon him by the population. So, again, this sounds a whole lot like social work philosophy. While Moreno's work is he's mostly known as a psychodramatist, and psychodrama is definitely the most popular of his work. It's important to keep in mind that sociometry was not just an approach to therapy, but really a systems theory. Moreno wrote just as many books about psychotherapy and psychodrama as he wrote about society and social change. So in many ways, I think of Moreno as not just a therapist or a psychiatrist or a clinician, but he also was working in the macro field. He is a good role model for bridging the gap between macro social work and clinical social work, while emphasizing meso social work, group work, as one of the bridges between the two. Moreno suggests that every individual is tied to their social atom as closely as we are to our bodies, and that even when our relationships change, our social atom, the constellation within it, tends to maintain consistency. That the constellation tends to repeat itself. In another publication in 1941, Moreno writes, this is a quote, "As the individual projects his emotions into the groups around him, and as the members of these groups in turn project their emotions toward him, a pattern of attractions and repulsions, as projected from both sides, can be discerned on the threshold between individual and group. This pattern is called a social atom." So this is what Moreno means by the social atom. You can see an example of a social atom, and this is an example from chapter 5 in my book. As you can see here, we use different objects, different shapes corresponding to different genders. Again, the traditional way of doing this would be to use triangles to represent men or male, and to use circles to represent female. For a while, I was suggesting that we use stars to represent any transgender or non-binary persons on the social atom. But I really like the idea of getting rid of the shapes altogether and letting clients use whatever shape they feel like it to represent the different people on their social atom. I think it really honors the uniqueness of each person's personality rather than focusing it more so on their gender. Traditionally, one would use squares or rectangles to represent objects or entities or organizations. And then you can see in the key here, we also use dotted lines or dashed lines in the shape to represent when somebody's deceased. So in this example, you can see that the person who drew the social atom, they have a lost relationship with Sandy, who is someone who's deceased. You can see, based on the squiggly line there, that they have a conflicting relationship with Dan. And you can see by the solid lines in the other relationships that they have a number of connected relationships within their life. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the social atom is, of course, a self-assessment. And you could experiment with trying to draw someone else's social atom based on your perception of their social life. That would be an interesting experiment, to have a child draw their own social atom and to have that child's parent draw their child's social atom and compare their parents' perception of their client's social atom, or their child's social atom, with the child's self-perception of their social atom. You could do that in a number of different ways. Partners could do that for each other, a client and therapist. There's different ways that you could experiment with the social atom. So the social atom can be a pen-to-paper assessment. It's often used as a warm-up for psychodrama or for psychodramatic sculpting, which we'll talk about it in some of the other videos here. And it can be used on its own as an exercise. We could put the social atom into action by having the group identify a protagonist, taking the protagonist's social atom and asking them to choose different people in the group to play the roles of the different people on their social atom. And they could stand in the center of their social atom in the group and explore their relationships in an embodied way. We could have them reverse roles with the different people in their social atom, offer doubling statements from the different people in their social atom, experiment with nonverbal messages, body postures, and positionings within their social atom and their different relationships, and experiment with creating change within the social atom in action, exploring what it might feel like to change some of the relationships in the social atom and concretize that change through action. We'll talk more about that in some of the other videos as well. But the social atom really is core to sociometry theory and to sociometry practice. Now, similar to the social atom is what's called the cultural atom. The cultural atom exists within the social atom. So while the social atom is a depiction of all the close social relationships surrounding an individual, the cultural atom is a depiction of all the role relationships within all of those social relationships. Moreno defines it as the pattern of role relationships around an individual as their focus is called his social or his cultural atom. Every individual, just as he has a set of friends and a set of enemies, the social atom, also has a range of roles facing a range of counter roles. So the cultural atom depicts all of the role relationships, the roles and counter roles, the reciprocal roles, the complementary roles, all of the roles within each of the relationships that are important to somebody. And role relationships can manifest in a number of different ways. They can be formal or informal. They can be symmetrical. They can be complementary to each other. Roles can be reciprocal in that they're roles that exist in reciprocity to each other. For example, the role of teacher and student, or parent and child. There are different reciprocal roles, victim and perpetrator. Roles can be triangulated with additional roles, and roles can be conflicting with each other. An example might be that my wife loves to dance, and I'm someone who doesn't like to dance at all. So these are conflicting roles in our relationship with each other. Whereas we have other complementary roles where we both are travelers. We love to travel. And so her role of traveler and my role of traveler are complementary roles. They're symmetrical. and they work really well together. So within every relationship, we can discern multiple role relationships. Each individual personality develops and exists within this matrix of role relationships and role reciprocity, which give expression to the various aspects of the self. So if you remember from the previous video on Chapter 4, that role theory is Psychodrama's theory of personality, that the self emerges from all the roles that we hold and play in our life. I've been thinking a lot more about how our self emerges in reciprocity with and in relationship with the closest people in our life. And that perhaps our earliest roles are usually roles where we're in role reciprocity with others in our life. And so there's a lot more we could say about role theory, which was covered in another video. I encourage you to check out that video if you haven't already. On the screen now, you are looking at a cultural atom. So you can tell it looks a lot like a role atom. It looks a lot like a social atom. However, it's a little more detailed and complex in that it not only includes the shapes and lines between an individual and the other people in their life, but it also includes and labels the roles and role relationships within those relationships. So, for example, on this cultural atom, you can see the protagonist has 3 different labeled role relationships with Dan. And they're all conflictual roles. Another way of adding detail to the cultural atom is to include plus and minus signs or equal signs to indicate the nature of the role relationships. So the plus sign would indicate that they're complementary roles that go hand in hand with each other. A plus and a minus sign would indicate that they're conflicting, or they could be conflicting roles in the way they're experienced. And the equal sign would mean that they're more so complementary. They're not so emotionally charged. So different ways of indicating the nature of the role relationships. In the example here between the protagonist and Dan, you can see there's conflict in their reciprocal roles of boyfriend and girlfriend. You can see there's also conflict in the roles of roommate and roommate. And you can see that there's conflict in the roles of musician and musician, which are more complementary roles. So if you take a look at and study this cultural atom, you can extract a whole lot more detail and information about the nature of one's relationships than is on the social atom by itself. So if you really want a lot more details about one's social atom, you could invite them to draw a cultural atom. This is an aspect of Moreno's sociometry, which often gets overlooked and doesn't get talked about or written about much. At the bottom here, you can see the key for depicting the cultural atom. Just to clarify the piece on plus, minus, and equal signs there, you can see the plus signs means positive or attracting. The negative sign means negative and repulsion towards the counter role. And the equal means that it's more of a neutral, that there isn't so much attraction or repulsion between the two roles. So Moreno considered the social atom to be the smallest functioning unit of society. He considered the cultural atom to be the smallest functioning unit of culture. He believed that societal and cultural values are transmitted through the social atom, through the cultural atom, and role relationships within them. that roles are often socially constructed and held, existing in reciprocity and reciprocal interaction between culture, between society, and the individual. So another aspect of sociometry theory is called the sociogram. And so the sociogram was one of the first sociometry tools that was created. It was first used all the way back in 1915 in Mittendorf refugee camp. It was then used again in the early 1930s in Sing Sing prison in Moreno's research, during which he would go on to coin the term group psychotherapy, 1932. The sociogram, as you can see in the image here, is a depiction of the distribution of choices or connections within a small group, or it could be done in a large group as well. The example that you're looking at is from a sociometric test that I actually conducted in a social work classroom. So in the classroom, as a way to teach about sociograms and sociometric tests, I asked all the students to write on a piece of paper or email me 3 names of peers in the class in order of preference. Who would you like to co-facilitate a group warm-up with in the classroom? And so everybody sent me their responses with their preferences of who they would like to co-facilitate with. And I took all the responses, inputted them into a program which created and generated this sociogram, depicting the distribution of choices and preferences within the classroom. Now, nowadays, there's a half dozen different programs that you can choose from to generate sociograms online. A number of them are free programs. When Moreno created sociograms, of course, none of these programs and technology existed, and they would actually hand draw their sociograms, which can get quite complicated. In the sociogram here, if we look closely and analyze it a bit, we can see that student number 11 is the social star. At least in this criteria, student 11 is the star. They've received by far the most amount of choices from their peers in the class. It looks like 7 people chose student number 11. If we look closely, we can also see that students number 2, 10, and 8 have all received the second highest amount of choices, 4 choices each. If we look a little closer, we can see that student number 6 is the isolate in the classroom when it comes to this criteria, that only one other student chose them for this prompt. So there's other things that we can extract from the sociogram depiction here. There's in sociometry, there's a lot of importance given to reciprocal choices, mutual choices, when 2 people choose each other for the same prompt. If we look closely, we can see that student 2 and student 8, that all of their choices were reciprocated, reciprocal choices. All of the 3 people they chose to be co-facilitators, they preferred, those same 3 people chose them, in addition to others. So this would be significant sociometrically. There's a couple concepts in sociometry, social phenomenons, that Moreno labeled based on his analysis of dozens and dozens of sociograms and different sociometric tests. One of them is called the sociodynamic effect. So this is a phenomenon that describes the underlying dynamic within all social groups, large and small, which influences the distribution of social wealth and choices and preferences within that group, always resulting in the group having social stars and having social isolates, the unequal distribution of choices of social wealth. This is called the sociodynamic effect. Moreno writes that when he started doing sociometric research, and they compiled all the choices within groups in their sociometric tests, they expected that the choices would result in a normal probability distribution, kind of like a bell curve. But what they found in every sociometric test is that the distribution of choices is always unequally distributed, prior to intervention at least. And this is what they termed the sociodynamic effect. Moreno specifically defines it as a universally present and appearing like a halo effect inherent in every social structure. So the sociodynamic effect is responsible for all inequality in society, responsible for racism, for poverty, for discrimination, for the unequal distribution of resources, of wealth within groups, within society, the unequal distribution of power. So the sociodynamic effect is an important aspect of sociometry in that all group workers, social workers, psychodramatists, and sociometrists, especially leaders, organizational leaders, need to be aware of and attuned to how the sociodynamic effect is negatively impacting their groups and organizations. So part of the role of a sociometrist, group worker, is to identify the sociodynamic effect and to reverse it, to actively intervene in the group dynamics and promote a more equitable group structure and experience. It's important to note, too, that this is just one example of a sociogram based on one criteria, and that in the same group, I could have asked different criteria, different prompts, different questions, which would have resulted in different sociometric structures and sociograms. And so if I asked different questions with different content, rather than who would you like to co-facilitate a warm-up with, we would end up with different sociometric stars and different isolates. If I asked who would you like to co-author a paper with, we would get a different constellation of choices. If I had asked who would you like to go on a trip with, we would get a different constellation of choices. If I asked who would you like to organize a social activist event with, we would get a different distribution of choices. Who would you trust as a therapist for a loved one? We would end up with different choices. Who would you like to get to know more about? So it's always important to keep in mind that although someone might be a sociometric star or isolate based on a single prompt in a single group, that most people, perhaps everyone, has groups where they're a social star and has other groups where they're a social isolate. Has certain criteria where they're the social star and other criteria where they're a social isolate. And so I find that important to highlight and acknowledge, especially when doing sociometric tests with students and with clients. So the second core sociometric concept to highlight, which emerged from Moreno's research, sociometric research, his sociograms, is what he called tele. T-E-L-E, tele. Although tele in the psychodrama community is primarily discussed in psychodrama and in role-playing and psychodramatic enactments, it actually was discovered through Moreno's sociometric research. Moreno realized that the number of reciprocal choices within a group, based on any prompt, the number of mutual choices, the number of times people chose each other, always was unexpectedly higher than what one might predict based on probability or statistics. That there always were more mutual choices than we would expect. And he defined this phenomenon as tele. He says the trend toward mutuality of attraction and repulsion many times surpasses chance and possibility. The factor responsible for this effect is called tele. Says that every wholesome human relationship depends on the presence of tele, and that it's a type of kind of like a socio-gravitational force which brings humans together more often than we would without it. Some people describe tele as a sort of two-way empathy, but it's more than just empathy. Another way that Moreno defines tele is that it's the opposite of transference. So transference is a distortion of reality and of the relationship. It's a projection from the past into the here and now, whereas tele is an accurate, a two-way accurate knowing and seeing and experiencing of another person. Moreno writes, by definition, transference tends to produce a dissociation of interpersonal relations. In contrast, tele strengthens associations and promotes continuity, security, stability, reciprocity, and cohesiveness of groups. So, tele is a mechanism by which group cohesion emerges. And the Morenos defined group cohesion as being a function of the number of reciprocal and mutual choices within that group. So one of the ways that we can think about group cohesion from a sociometric perspective, and as sociometrists working with groups, is to begin groups, especially groups in earlier phases of their development, to use exercises that promote one-on-one connection between group members, so that we can cultivate mutual choices, mutuality, and reciprocal relationships within that group, which will contribute to the overall sense of group cohesion. So, tele is kind of an interesting thing in that many psychodramatists have difficulty providing a straightforward definition of what exactly tele is, but every psychodramatist could point out to you, that right there, that thing that just happened, that was tele. Tele was involved in that interaction. Perhaps the most common way that tele manifests in psychodrama is through the protagonist's choice of roles. That when we're in the midst of a psychodrama enactment, and I ask the protagonist, hey, you said you wanted to offer forgiveness to your father in this psychodrama. Can you pick someone to play the role of your father? And they look around the group, and they don't know why, but they stop on Johnny, group member, and they say, Johnny, I want you to play the role of my dad. Will you play that role? They don't know why they picked Johnny. They just had a knowing, a sensation, an intuition, a conscious or unconscious hit that Johnny should be the person to play this role. And they pick Johnny. Johnny comes in and plays the role, and it becomes evident at the end of the psychodrama when Johnny starts to share about how they wish their son would forgive them for something they did. And there was a reciprocity in the roles and the relationships between Johnny and the protagonist. And we would say, that right there was tele. You didn't know why, but you had an unconscious knowing that Johnny was the person to play that role. That was because of tele. And on the other hand, the role player will often say, I just knew you were going to pick me. I didn't know why, but I just knew I was going to be chosen to play that role. And so it's often it's a two-way knowing in the interaction. Tele also is at play in doubling, when the director or group members offer doubling statements for a protagonist or a role. The attunement that comes with that doubling is based on tele in some part. And it's also at play in role reversal, that when a client role reverses with another, or when an auxiliary role reverses taking on the role of another, that their ability to play that role is in part based on their telic connection to that person or to that role. So there's lots of different ways that it shows up throughout sociometry and psychodrama practice. Important to keep in mind that it actually originated in sociometry research, sociograms. So a number of Moreno's sociograms were also generated through his research in the Hudson Valley at a girls' reform school. It was at this girls' reform school where Moreno was actually hired as the director of social research for the New York State Department of Social Welfare. So here we see another connection between Moreno and the social work field. He was working for the Department of Social Welfare. And in his role, he did research using his sociograms on this group of over 500 community members in this girls' reform school. And he not only drew sociograms like the one I showed to you, but he generated these larger scale social networks. And so he experimented in his research at the girls' reform school, experimented with different methods, different avenues to try to uncover and better understand how these social networks worked. He often called them psychosocial networks. One of the interesting things that he did in order to map out the social networks within this large community is he would identify an individual in the community, take a look at the social atom surrounding that individual, and he would give that individual a rumor. He would tell them something completely untrue, tell them something crazy, a wild story about someone else in the community, or just a fabricated story, a rumor. And then they would assess how long it took for that rumor to spread to other community members. And he would measure the amount of time it took for the rumor to get to someone else in the community, to get to someone who the original person was completely unconnected to in their social atom. And by doing this, he would map out the complex social network within this larger community. And he started to think of social networks as these underlying emotional psychosocial currents within communities by which information spreads through the connections between individuals. He writes that the discovery that human society has an actual dynamic central structure underlying and determining all of its peripheral and formal groupings may one day be considered the cornerstone of all social sciences. So he really believed that these sociometric ideas were really important for understanding social sciences and understanding society. In 1943, he writes that sociometry, because of the unity of the human group, studies the human group as a totality. It studies every part with a view to the totality, and the totality with a view to every part. So again, you can see the connection between macro and micro in Moreno's sociometric system. Moreno was deeply committed to this vision that he had, where what he called sociometry, healing for society. He believed that working one-on-one with folks was simply not enough, and that we had to engage in larger groups. We had to promote healing within all of society, within communities. We had to work within groups to create change. Moreno had this other idea called the organic unity of mankind. And so this describes the phenomenon of the entire human group being its own entity. That we talk about smaller groups as taking on a group as a whole experience, that the group becomes its own entity, that it's more than just the sum of all of its parts. And he applied this same concept, this same idea, to all of humanity. He believed that there was this organic unity within humanity that bound us together as parts of the same species and of the same group, parts of all of humanity or society, that our humanness bound us together. Sometimes he referred to it as a sort of primordial nature. So, considering that mankind is a unity, Moreno writes that there's these tendencies between parts of society to draw it together at times into unity and to pull it apart into disunity and fragmentation at other times. He says that these integrative and disintegrative forces are detectable within the system of attractions and repulsions within social networks, groups, social atoms, and relationships. He writes, and I quote him, that the human group has a science configuration of its own. And so, when we're thinking about sociometry and sociometry, I just want to also take a moment and identify that all of this exists within even a larger framework. That Moreno, he liked to create words and ideas, and he was incredibly prolific in generating and creating new concepts and labeling phenomenons that others hadn't labeled before. If you can imagine a larger umbrella of what Moreno called sociodynamics, and that within this umbrella, this umbrella of sociodynamics, that there's three parts. Sociodynamics being about the study of society, of social forces. That the branch of science dealing with all things social, basically. That there were three branches from that overarching umbrella of sociodynamics. First one being sociodynamics, and that this was about social measurement, exploring the sociodynamics rather than just the psychodynamics, exploring sociodynamics within groups, within social atoms, within sociograms, and social networks. The second branch being about healing society, and this is called sociometry. So sociometry is about all the different interventions that we employ, the different interventions Moreno created: psychodrama, sociometry, group psychotherapy, sociodrama, to promote healing within society. Sociometry. So we have, underneath sociometry, we have sociodynamics, we have sociometry, and then we have sociometry, which is the science of social laws. So it can be helpful to conceptualize the bigger picture here as well. Now, at the end of Moreno's famous book, Who Shall Survive, he actually proposes over 100 hypotheses for future sociometric research. And these are later restructured in his 1943 publication, Sociometry and the Cultural Order. And in that later publication, he organizes them into 8 hypotheses about the organic unity of mankind. So I'm going to go through those 8 hypotheses briefly. This is really getting into some of the complexities of Moreno's sociometric system that often get overlooked. The first hypothesis is what Moreno calls sociogenetic law. And this describes how human society becomes more and more complex and more differentiated over time. That human society starts off as being less complex. It's more simple. It's a smaller group. There's less differentiation and complexity. It's more undifferentiated. And that over time, throughout the history of humankind and throughout the history of society, as society grows, it grows to become more complex and differentiated. That there's different groupings and social networks and social atoms within society that get more complex and differentiate from each other. In some ways, this is a parallel process for how groups, communities, organizations, and families evolve over time. And even how our individual biology has evolved over time, from being more simple organisms, and throughout the timeline of evolution, how we've become more complex, and how the different systems within our body and within our brain have become more differentiated and have a lot more complexity than our ancestors going way back. So this describes sociogenetic law. The second hypothesis is what Moreno describes as the reality testing of social configurations. And so this describes that in reality, where groups are formed intentionally, they will always be more complex than groups that are formed by chance or than by groups that are generated randomly by computers, or even intentionally by computer algorithms. That when we compare randomly generated groups or groups that a computer generates, and we compare those with groups that are actually created in reality, that the real groups are always going to be more complex. There's going to be much more layers of complexity. And that this would come back to the sociodynamic effect, to tele, the organic unity of mankind, and the system of attractions and repulsions within relationships. The third hypothesis is what Moreno calls the reality testing of cultural configurations. So similar to the second hypothesis, but this is about cultural configurations. And this describes how the role, this ties into role theory, role is the mechanism by which culture is exchanged. And that real role relationships and cultural atoms will always be more complex than role relationships or cultural atoms that are generated by chance or that are generated by a computer. So very similar to the second hypothesis, except this is focused on role relationships and culture. The fourth hypothesis is about the sociodynamic effects, which I described previously. This underlying social dynamic at play in all social groupings, which results in the distribution of choices, of social wealth, preferences being unequally distributed. The fifth hypothesis is about the social atom being the smallest functioning unit of the human group. That when we look at things in their totality, all of society, the entire human group, the organic unity of mankind, humans as a species, we can look at it on the macro level, and as we start to hone in our focus into smaller and smaller groups, smaller and smaller units, social units, from society to larger social networks and communities, into social atoms and sociograms, into relationships and social atoms, that the social atom, the depiction of relationships, is the smallest unit within the human group. The sixth hypothesis is titled Psychological Currents and Networks. And so this would be what I had referenced previously about social networks, psychosocial networks. These are the invisible sociometric webs within large groups, the invisible currents by which information flows between people. So Moreno had hypothesized nearly 100 years ago that these individual social networks exist within larger groups. The seventh hypothesis is called the law of social gravity. And this is a hypothesis that proposes that relationships between human beings are largely impacted by physical proximity and distance between human beings. That our physical proximity, the people that we are physically closest to and geographically closest to, are often also the folks who we are psychologically and emotionally and socially closest to. So without technology, without YouTube, without Zoom, without WhatsApp, without phones and computers, the folks who we're most intimately connected to are almost always the people who we're physically closest to in proximity. So this is called the law of social gravity. This certainly still applies in today's world, the modern world, with all the technology that we have. And there's ways that technology allows us to transcend some of the limits of this law of social gravity. Kind of similar to how there's ways that technology allows us to transcend the laws of gravity in general, how we can fly in airplanes and how we can travel into space. So technology really impacts this one. The eighth hypothesis is that the psychosocial organization and function, the psychosocial organization of groups impacts its function. So this reminds me of osteopathic medicine and its philosophy, that the Moreno is saying the structure of a group or of society or of a community or of a social atom or sociogram, the structure of it has a determining influence on the functioning of it and its leadership. So the ways that groups are structured impact how they function. And so this really highlights the importance of sociometry yet again, that we need to be able to assess, identify, and intervene on, change the underlying structures within groups so that we can help them function in more optimal ways. So these are the 8 hypotheses that Moreno outlines related to the organic unity of mankind. So in thinking of this, all of this in the context of social work, there's a ton of connections that can be drawn and lots of overlaps I've already highlighted. Perhaps the biggest overlap is the connection with social work's person and environment theory, that sociometry really, really highlights and echoes the importance of looking at individuals within their social environment. This is operationalized through the social atom, through the sociogram, through the theories of sociometry and interpersonal relations. Another connection that we have is how the social atom influenced the development of the genogram and ecomap. How, just like sociometry tries to balance qualitative and quantitative research and the importance of involving research participants in the research designs, the urgency of meeting people in their real social environments, so too does the social work field. There's 2 core social work ethical values, ethical principles, which are really emphasized in sociometry. One is the importance of human relationships, which I don't think I really need to expand on any more about how sociometry places importance in the value of human relationships. And the second is social justice, which is a core social work ethical principle, is also inherent in sociometric theory, and that we're looking at reversing the sociodynamic effects. We're looking at creating change within all of society. We're holding on to this vision of societry, of a creative revolution that Moreno proposed 100 years ago. That we're not just working with individuals, but we're working with larger groups, and we're working to create macro-level change within communities, within society. In 1950, Jacob Moreno actually wrote an article that was titled "The Sociometric Approach to Social Casework." This is one of the few pieces where Moreno explicitly connects his work to the social work field, which was still in its infancy when Moreno was developing his ideas. Although he never describes himself as a social worker, I like to think of him as a social worker. Moreno writes, "Man does not live alone and does not get sick by himself. His problems develop in groups. The mental and physical equilibrium of an individual depends to a considerable degree upon the dynamic interplay of these various individual and social forces." So you can see a connection here in social work philosophy, where we're attuned to how social forces, how systemic issues impact individuals and contribute to individual problems that individuals experience, contribute to mental illness. One of Moreno's colleagues and students, Helen Jennings, writes that the task of sociometry is to transform society to fit man, rather than trying to transform man to fit within society. And there's a whole lot of social workers who I've heard say similar things. So we can find another connection here between sociometry and social work approach. Similar to social work, sociometry also offers a bridge between clinical and macro work, that both systems, social work and sociometry, orient and focus on the importance of macro work and clinical work, as well as that meso work, the group work in between. So there's a whole lot of connections here between Moreno's sociometric system and social work in general. So I really hope that you found this video helpful. If you wanted to read more about these connections, you can check out chapter 5 in the book. Again, you can download the entire book for free online, and we'll put a link to the book in the description here. If you found the book helpful, it would really go a long ways to consider writing an Amazon review, an honest review about the book. If you found this video helpful, it would also help me and help others see this content if you were to like the video or subscribe to the video. Comment on the video. Let me know what stood out to you about this presentation of sociometry. Let me know if you have any questions about sociometry. Let me know if there's other videos that I haven't made yet that would be really helpful for you that you'd like to see in the future. I'm really interested in hearing from you and hearing about how this content lands on you, how it's useful for you, or how it challenges you, how it fits with ways that you understand other theories, other ways of working. I'm really interested in connecting. So thanks again for watching this video, and check out some of the other videos on our channel here.